All right, good evening, everybody. We've got a lot of ground to cover tonight. Got a lot of ground to cover the rest of this quarter. So let's go ahead and get our class started. We'll have a word of prayer, and then we'll get into our lesson. Father in heaven, we love you, and we thank you for loving us. Thank you for loving us so much that you sent your Son to be a sacrifice on our behalf. Thank you for loving us so much that even though we sin, and sometimes we sin often, that you forgive us and that you extend your grace and mercy to us. Help us, Lord, to appreciate the depth of your love. Help us, Lord, to demonstrate that we love you by following your teachings and your commands, by living a life that you have asked us to live, because we know this will be good for us and it will give you glory and it will be encouraging to others. Lord, we live in a very sinful world filled with sinful people. Lord, we live in a world that for many has no hope, and many seek ways to find hope and to find satisfaction in life. And help us, Lord, to be salt and light. Help us, Lord, to point the world to you. Help us, Lord, to live such lives and to use such words that when people see us and hear us, they see Jesus living in us, that we perfectly reflect your Son, and that we are an encouragement and a beacon of hope to those around. Lord, give us courage and wisdom. Help us to make good decisions. Help us, Lord, to love you and love our neighbors. And help us, Lord, tonight as we study about Job, to have the patience and the faith and the determination to follow you that he did. Pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, good evening, everyone. We're going to pick up. I'm missing the screen back here for anyone in charge of the TV back here. We're going to pick up at the end of the first cycle of speeches. We've been on this for a few class periods now. And as a reminder, the heart of the book of Job is really this conversation between Job and his three friends, and it goes in three cycles, where Job has said something, starting in chapter 3, and then each of his friends will have a response, and then he'll have a response to each of them, and it goes through these. So the first cycle is the longest, and it is also, as hard as it may be to believe, it is also probably the closest thing we have to an actual conversation. We'll get into the second cycle tonight, and we'll find that the second cycle of speeches falls apart. As a reminder, in each of these speakers has a very distinct position. Job is saying all along that he is innocent. He doesn't know why he is suffering. He doesn't know why this is happening. But he's innocent of whatever the friends think he may be guilty of that has caused all of this suffering to happen. Eliphaz seems to be saying, in the first cycle of speeches at least, you're a good person, Job. We know you're a good person, so don't let this turn you away from God. Don't let this destroy you. Stick it out. Bildad just assumes that Job has sinned, and he deserves whatever has happened, but he says, if you'll just turn back to God, everything will be okay. And then Zophar, who we'll look at tonight, he says you really deserve worse than you're getting. And so he presumes a lot of sin, but he also offers a wonderful message of hope and an invitation to come back to God. So we read through Job's response last time, but we didn't have time to go through and just kind of summarize. So we're going to summarize quickly chapters 12 through 14. And this is Job replying to Zophar, the third friend, whose response, as we said a moment ago, was very harsh. It was very direct. He said, in essence, your children got what they deserved. You deserve even more than you got. But then, as I said, he offers a very heartfelt call to Job to come back to God. So Job, replying to Zophar, we read this last time, he challenges the friends. He reminds them that he is righteous, he is blameless. He hasn't brought this particular destruction on himself, He doesn't know why that was done. He laments that now he's become a laughingstock. He used to be a very wise and respected person. He used to be one, and we'll read later in his monologue, starting in chapter 29, he used to be one who everybody came to for counsel. He used to be one who sat at the gates of the city and was a judge, and he was one that everybody listened to. And he says now he is a laughingstock. He has become an object of scorn and of ridicule. Once again, he says this is God doing this. The friends are saying you did this to yourself. He's saying, no, this is God targeting me. And he says, if you guys would even just look around at nature, he says, just nature tells us that God is in control of everything. And you guys are saying that I am responsible. Moving on very quickly, he has another doxology that we read, and in this one he was essentially saying, yes, God is powerful, God is great, God is almighty, but God only uses those things to cause harm and to cause destruction. Then he turns back to his friends, and he says in chapter 13, verse 5, one of the best things that I thought he could possibly say. He said, at this point, the best thing you could do is just shut up. He said, if you would just shut your mouths, then that would be a display of your wisdom. And I think he's hearkening back to when they originally showed up, and they sat there with him for 7 days in silence because they knew his suffering was great, and they weren't going to say anything to him to provoke him. He says that their words are lies. He says you're just talking and you're rambling, and he says the more you talk, the more you expose your lack of wisdom. Is there any honesty in that sentiment, just in general? Is there any wisdom in just shutting up sometimes? Tim? Yeah? Yep. Listen and learn. And sometimes we just double down, don't we? You know, we say something, we know it's wrong. I'm thinking of politicians right now in particular who will say a lie, and they know it's a lie, and they know eventually it's going to be exposed, but they just keep saying the same thing over and over. But we do that. I've done that in arguments. Don't feel alone, Tim. You're not alone. I've done it too. And sometimes, and even if it's not even an argument, sometimes you're just trying to console people, and you're just trying to talk to them, and some silly things can come out of our mouths, right? I think we've all heard them at time to time, that you just, in an effort to console or an effort to support, you start rambling and you start saying things that just aren't necessary, maybe not intentionally hurtful, but also not necessary. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in what Job is saying. Tell us his friends, if you want to be wise, just shut up. Stop talking, because the more you say, the worse it sounds. He tells them later in chapter 13 that their words are going to come back to haunt them. And he doesn't know quite how right he is, obviously, but God will later on speak directly to Eliphaz, and he will tell Eliphaz, you and your two friends have spoken incorrectly. And so God is hearing this conversation, and God is going to come back and say this. So Job is a bit of a prophet here without knowing it. And then he says their words are just ashes and clay. He says they're nothing. Your words are dust. They're not helpful. He goes on then to say that he's going to be vindicated. And he says in verse 15, a very bold statement of faith. Even if he kills me, I will hope in him. Nevertheless, I will still defend my ways. Job seems to be acknowledging that God is attacking him and that eventually God may kill him. That's what he seems to be saying. But he says, even so, I have hope in him. And this is going to come up later on in another reply. He says, even so, I have hope in him, and I'm going to defend myself. He's standing up for himself. He's willing to say that it wasn't sin that caused this in his life. And then he says, starting in verse 20 of chapter 13, that God is harming an innocent person. And he asks God in a few ways to help him. So in verse 21, he says, "Stop terrorizing me. Take your hand away. God, you're doing this to me. Just stop whatever you're doing." Verse 22, he says, "Answer my questions. I have questions. I want to know what have I done? Why is this happening?" So he's asking for answers. Verse 23, he says specifically, "Tell me, specifically, have I sinned? Tell me what my sins are. Let me know." We know that Job is, going all the way back to the very beginning, has always been very thoughtful and very conscientious, hasn't he? Remember what he did for his own children. He offered sacrifices just in case they sinned. He offered sacrifices. So Job is correctly puzzled by what's happening. And he is correctly at a loss as to why this is happening. But maybe there was a sin he just wasn't aware of. And so he says, "Tell me." And then he asks God finally, "Just stop being my enemy." Job will talk about how he used to be very close to God and how he used to have a very close relationship. And now he is considered an enemy. And then chapter 14, this whole chapter is really just a very dismal view, like we've seen before, specifically in chapter 3, where life is futile. There's no point in going on. Job said that he said that he wishes that his life was like that of a hired hand who just put in his hard effort and then was able to sleep at night and drew his wages. He accuses again, in verse 19, God of destroying him. And then he concludes this chapter by saying there's no point to life. It's just pitiful, and the whole point of life seems to just be suffering and to die alone, which is a sad thing to say when you're right there with at least 3 of your supposedly close friends. All right, so that wraps up the first cycle. The second cycle is much shorter, and the third cycle is very short, in case you were wondering about the schedule. So we saw in the first round where each person had a bit of a distinct position, and they had a clear view, and they kind of stuck with it. What we see here is in the second round, Job's 3 friends are all essentially saying the same thing. They may add on as they go through. One friend will say something and have a list of what a wicked person looks like, and then the next friend will have a few more things to add, and then the third friend a few more things. But essentially they're saying all of the same things. Job, for the most part, is talking more to God and less to the friends. In the first cycle of speeches, he would always start talking to his friends directly, and then at some point he would just drift off and start just talking into the ether or talking to God directly. Here he seems to be spending more time focused on conversing with God, or at least trying to. And the speeches here really just become arguments. And we're going to see some language that we might recognize if we've ever been in an argument, where people just say things that are hurtful and argumentative. And they all start with a strong insult to the other person. We see at this point there's complete polarization. Whereas before there was kind of this melding of ideas and there was kind of a sense of we're all trying to help Job, now it's completely polarized. They're clearly taking 2 sides. All 3 of the friends clearly presume Job is guilty. There's no question at this point. And they all make the same argument. And their argument is basically, they talk about, they describe what a wicked man looks like. And they talk about the suffering that a wicked man endures. And really all they're doing is they're looking at Job, and they're just listing things about Job. And they're describing Job in such a way that he can clearly recognize they're talking about him. But he's going to come back with his own description of a wicked man, which we'll look at in a bit. We won't see any invitations in this round. They're not going to tell Job, hey, if you'll just turn back to God, he'll help. There's no reference to hope. So this gets really ugly and really dark. Speaking about the descriptions of the wicked, we'll see for each of these people who are speaking, the bulk of their speeches are describing a wicked person. So Eliphaz has 16 out of the 35 verses that he speaks. You can see that there. Bildad, Zophar. Job's final speech in this round, 10 out of, or a third of the verses essentially, are describing a wicked person. And it seems that the more bitter Job becomes and the more that he continues to say he's innocent, the angrier and the more determined the friends get to prove him wrong. And we can see that they're essentially, they're now not trying to help him figure it out. They're not trying to offer any consolation to him. At this point, they are now trying to just prove him wrong. And the whole point of their argument is just get him to finally admit he's wrong. And of course, what's the problem with that? Job isn't wrong. Job is not suffering because of his sin. Job is not being targeted by God because he was unrighteous. In fact, to the contrary, nobody knows this except God and those who were in that early conversation. Job has become a target because of his righteousness. Job has become a target because God said that Job fears God. And Satan said, no, he doesn't. He just likes all the good stuff you give him. And that's the reason Job is suffering. So it's become a pointless argument here. Job's description of the wicked, not to spoil it, but he basically says, you guys have been describing what a wicked person looks like, and it's all these bad things. He says, no, in fact, a wicked person, they're living high on the hog. They're fat and happy. They have everything that they want. And they go around being wicked and still having everything they want. They have plenty of food. They have safety. Their kids are with them. They're enjoying life, living their wicked and evil lives. And he says, I'm not wicked, and I'm exactly what you're describing. And so we see this elsewhere. Psalm 73, which I referenced here, very similar language to what Job uses about describing what a wicked person looks like. A number of the Psalms do that, in fact, but the rest of the Psalms that talk about the wicked people prospering and living high on the hog talks about eventually God is going to deal with it. And eventually God is seeing their wickedness and that they will be humbled before him. So let's get into the speech of Eliphaz in chapter 15. He takes a much harsher tone this time around. And he seems to just be disgusted with Job at this point. He's heard Job say all of these things, and he seems to just be really disgusted with Job and with his lack of wisdom. So let's get into chapter 15, book of Job. Starting in verse 1, then Eliphaz the Temanite replied, does a wise man answer with empty counsel or fill himself with the hot east wind? Should he argue with useless talk or with words that serve no good purpose? But you even undermine the fear of God and hinder meditation before him. Your iniquity teaches you what to say, and you choose the language of the crafty. Your own mouth condemns you, not me. Your own lips testify against you. When you were you the first man ever born, or were you brought forth before the hills? Do you listen in on the counsel of God, or have a monopoly on wisdom? What do you know that we don't know? What do you understand that is not clear to us? Both the gray-haired and the elderly are with us, older than your father. Are God's consolations not enough for you, even the words that deal gently with you? Why has your heart misled you, and why do your eyes flash as you turn your anger against God and allow such words to leave your mouth? What is a mere man that he should be pure, or one born of a woman that he should be righteous? If God puts no trust in his holy ones, and the heavens are not pure in his sight, how much less one who is revolting and corrupt, who drinks injustice like water? Listen to me, and I will inform you. I will describe what I have seen, what the wise have declared and not concealed, that came from their ancestors, to whom alone the land was given when no foreigner passed among them. A wicked person writhes in pain all of his days throughout the number of years reserved for the ruthless. Dreadful sounds fill his ears. When he is at peace, a robber attacks him. He doesn't believe he will return from darkness. He is destined for the sword. He wanders about for food, asking, where is it? He knows the days of darkness is at hand. Trouble and distress terrify him, overwhelming him like a king prepared for battle, for he has stretched out his hand against God and has arrogantly opposed the Almighty. He rushes headlong at him with his thick, studded shields, though his face is covered with fat and his waistline bulges with it. He will dwell in ruined cities and abandoned houses destined to become piles of rubble. He will no longer be rich. His wealth will not endure. His possessions will not increase. He will not escape from darkness. Flames will wither his shoots, and by the breath of God's mouth he will depart. Let him not put trust in worthless things, being led astray, for what he gets in exchange will prove worthless. It will be accomplished before his time, and his branch will not flourish. He will be like a vine that drops unripe grapes, and an olive tree that sheds blossoms. For the company of the godless will have no children, and fire will consume the tents of those who offer bribes. They conceive trouble and give birth to evil. Their wombs prepare deception. So, pretty harsh. We see that, first of all, he opens up by saying, Job, a wise person wouldn't talk like you talk. You talk about having wisdom, but you're saying things that no wise person would ever say. And then in verse 4, he contradicts something that he said himself way back in chapter 4, verse 6, that he says, Job, you undermine the fear of God. Before, he said, your righteousness, your piety, your fear of God was your hope. And now he says, Job, you don't even fear God, and worse, you undermine it. You make it so it's something that you don't want people to do. Of course, that's entirely contradictory to not only his own statement, but it's contradictory to what God said about Job, that Job himself feared God. And then he asks a series of questions to Job, and we'll get to this. I wanted to key in on this verse 11. And verse 11, it looks like he's talking about himself, Eliphaz, that is, and that his words and the words of the friends seem to be like consolations of God. And it's almost as though he is saying, Job, we're just trying to help. We're just speaking what God would have us speak to you, and you're rejecting that. I don't know if that's exactly what he means or not, but it seems like that's the case. And if such, then we're starting to see Eliphaz elevate himself a little higher than he ought to by considering his own words to be words from God, when clearly he is not saying the things that God would have him to say. In verses 12 and 13, he asks a few questions, but basically he's asking, why are you acting like this, Job? Why does your heart carry you away? Why are you saying these things? And to me, it's kind of a dumb question to ask in the moment, considering what Job has been through. But that's kind of an argumentative thing where you start to say things without thinking, and I think that was the case here. Later on, he goes and he repeats the vision that we read about and discussed from previously in the first cycle. And then he gets into this section where he talks about the wicked. And he starts to describe what a wicked person looks like. And look at this list. This sounds an awful lot like Job, doesn't it? A wicked person writhes in pain, sounds of terror in his ear. While he is at peace, the destroyer or destruction comes upon him. He never believes he'll return from darkness. Has Job said that a few times? He has. Eliphaz has heard that. He stretches his hand against God. He lives in a desolate city. His crops will fail. He's self-deceived. Eliphaz is just starting to say things that I almost think he's just looking at Job and just trying to think of all the things about Job, and he's putting those into this list of what a wicked person looks like. And this wicked person description with all of the friends, it's clearly an attempt to poke at Job. It's clearly an attempt to say things that are hurtful, and that Job is going to hear them and he's going to think, well, that's me. Yeah, my children are gone. My crops are gone. My home is destroyed. My hope is gone. My friends are gone. They're clearly intending to poke at him. And in verse 31, we see that Eliphaz ultimately, he thinks that Job is just deluded, and that Job is just he's beyond understanding at this point. So over into chapter 16, Job has a reply for Eliphaz. Starting in verse 1, Then Job answered, I have heard many things like these. You are all miserable comforters. Is there no end to your empty words? What provokes you that you continue to testify? If you were in my place, I could also talk like you. I could string together words against you and shake my head at you. But instead, I would encourage you with my mouth, and the consolation from my lips would bring relief. And so right there, he tells Eliphaz, you're just kicking somebody when he's down, and that's easy to do. I could do that, but he says if the tables were turned and you were the one sitting over here in the garbage heap, covered in boils and suffering, he says, I wouldn't. I would use my words to encourage you. And he says the consolation, so he's using the same word Eliphaz used in the last chapter. The consolation of my lips would be for your benefit and to encourage you and to build you up. Verse 6, if I speak, my suffering is not relieved, and if I hold back, does any of it leave me? Surely he has now exhausted me. You have devastated my entire family. You have shriveled me up. It has become a witness. My frailty arises against me and testifies to my face. His anger tears at me, and he harasses me. He gnashes his teeth at me. My enemy pierced me with his eyes. They open their mouths against me and strike my cheeks with contempt. They join themselves together against me. God hands me over to the unjust. He throws me to the wicked. I was at ease, but he shattered me. He seized me by the scruff of the neck and smashed me to pieces. He set me up as his target. His archers surround me. He pierces my kidneys without mercy and pours my bile on the ground. He breaks through my defenses again and again. He charges at me like a warrior. I have sewn sackcloth over my skin. I have buried my strength in the dust. My face has grown red with weeping, and darkness covers my eyes, although my hands are free from violence and my prayer is pure. Earth, do not cover my blood. May my cry for help find no resting place. Even now my witness is in heaven, and my advocate is in the heights. My friends scoff at me as I weep before God. I wish that someone might argue for a man with God, just as anyone would for a friend. For only a few years will pass before I go the way of no return. Chapter 17, verse 1. My spirit is broken, my days are extinguished, a graveyard awaits me. Surely mockers surround me, and my eyes must gaze at their rebellion. Accept my pledge. Put up security for me. Who else will be my sponsor? You have closed their minds to understanding. Therefore, you will not honor them. If a man denounces his friends for a price, the eyes of his children will fail. He has made me an object of scorn to the people. I have become a man people spit at. My eyes have grown dim from grief, and my whole body has become but a shadow. The upright are appalled at this, and the innocent are roused against the godless. Yet the righteous person will hold to his way, and the one whose hands are clean will grow stronger. But come back and try again, all of you. I will not find a wise man among you. My days have slipped by, my plans have been ruined, even the things dear to my heart. They turned night into day and made light seem near in the face of darkness. If I await Sheol as my home, spread out my bed in darkness, and say to corruption, you are my father, and to the maggot, my mother or my sister, where then is my hope? Who can see any hope for me? Will it go down to the gates of Sheol, or will we descend together into the dust? So that's Job's response, and he's getting very pointed. And that let's break this down. First of all, he opens up by saying they're sorry comforters. They're offering nothing new, nothing helpful. They're just saying the same things over and over. He turns Eliphaz's words back on him from back in chapter 15 and verse 3. Job states that, we said this already, if the tables were turned on him and he was sitting where Eliphaz was, he would be a great comforter. He would be encouraging. He would bring relief to him. He says, it's easy to do what you're doing. Anybody can do that. He says in starting in verse 6, that God is the one attacking him, and there's a long list of things that he says have happened to him. And he starts to intermingle, as you just saw when we were reading that. He's starting to clearly intermingle the friends as part of the attack. And that the friends are now, and maybe they were. We talked about Job's wife possibly being spared because she was encouraging him to renounce God and to die. And maybe the friends are being used as pawns by Satan as well in this. We don't know, but nevertheless, Job is listing out all these things that are starting to happen to him, or that have been happening, and he's starting to introduce the fact that the friends are now part of it. The friends are the ones who are scoffing, and the friends are the ones who are saying untrue things about him. And then he pleads, starting in the latter half of chapter 16, for God's help. He's said a lot of severe things. He has said a lot of hard-to-hear things about God, and that God has been attacking him, and God has been responsible for his suffering, but yet he still holds fast and firmly believes that God is the one who will restore him and who will save him, and that God will be the one ultimately who brings about his full restoration, which of course is true. Job is talking about two sides of God here, and I wanted to talk about this just for a moment. He's talking about part of God's nature, which is God's grace and his love and his mercy, and then he's also talking about the other side, which we view as opposites, which is God's wrath and his judgment. And it seems contradictory that he would be talking about these two things simultaneously. That God, you're destroying me, but God, you're the one who will save me. God, you've taken away my hope, but God, you're my only hope. And he seems to be striking this balance, but that's not unique. We have a verse here from Nahum 1, verses 6 through 7. Who can stand before his indignation? Who can endure the heat of his anger? His wrath is poured out like fire, and the rocks are broken into pieces by him. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him. And this is a complex subject. I don't know that I have the answers as to how do you account for both sides. In some cases, it's very simple. If God's faithful people are suffering, then he pours out his mercy and his grace. When wicked people are doing things, we see judgment. These are things we see in Scripture very clearly, that there is judgment. But what about the times when it seems to be the opposite? What about the times like now when Job is suffering? Or what about the hundreds of years that the Israelites were suffering in slavery? Some of them, all they knew their whole lives, even though they were part of the chosen people of Israel, they spent their entire lives living in slavery and suffering under the Egyptians. What about that? That's the difficulty that I think we see, and we're certainly going to talk about more at the end of this quarter when we get through our applications. But it's very difficult to make sense of it for us, I think. And if you have made sense of it, I would love to talk to you about it. But it's very difficult to make sense of the fact that Job is saying, I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do. I'm listening to God. I'm doing whatever I'm supposed to do to please him. I'm living a righteous life. I'm doing all of these things, and yet I'm being attacked by God, and I am suffering at the hand of God. How do you make sense of that? And then he talks about, we'll look at it in a moment, he talks about the wicked. He says, you guys keep describing the wicked. Let me tell you what the wicked look like. And he's like, the wicked look like guys out here who are stealing, and they're taking from widows, and they're deceitful, and yet they're living a life of luxury, and their children are alive, and they're happy. And Job is trying to make sense of all this, and it's very difficult to do. And yeah, Matt, go ahead.
Job is a very personal sample. It's very, very targeted, and Job is isolated from the other people as far as we don't really know what was society like in Job's time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the highest level of point is that we live in a sinful world, and there are always consequences to sin. Sometimes we suffer consequences of other people's sin. Now, again, in the case of Job, that's not the case. Job is suffering because all the way back to that scene in heaven, he was put out there by God as being a person who was upright and who feared God. And Satan said, that's not true. Satan said, he's not upright and he fears you. He only serves you because you do good stuff for him. But make him suffer and he'll leave you. That's why it's happening to Job. But in general, yes, we have to, and we'll dig into this deeper, hopefully, but we have to understand that sin is the problem. And because of sin, it can impact all of us. And sometimes it's clear to see. I'm suffering because my spouse was unfaithful. Clear to see. I'm suffering because, I was addicted to drugs, and I was using drugs constantly. Clear to see. I'm suffering because somebody was driving drunk and killed or injured somebody I love. Those are easy things to see. But sometimes we suffer when it doesn't seem that there's any answer, and it doesn't make any sense. And hopefully we'll try to make some sense of it. But the fact of the matter is, I think like Job, sometimes we're not going to know, and we're not going to understand, and it's just going to be our burden to bear. And hopefully we bear it, and hopefully those around us help us to bear it as well. Continuing on, Job starts using this courtroom language, and we're seeing this more and more. He brought it in earlier, talking about having an advocate or having a mediator or an intercessor. Job is going to use more of this courtroom-style language and kind of treat this like a matter of law, which wouldn't be unusual because Job would have been one of the people who sat at the gates of his city, and he would have been a judge, and he would have heard cases, and he would have heard arguments from all sides. And so this is certainly not an unusual thing for him to do, but he's bringing more of that language into this. And then he tells his friends, he reminds his friends that they don't have any understanding of his situation. He talks about then becoming a byword or just an object of scorn, and he's going to talk more about that later in chapters 29 through 31. But he talks about being one who is now mocked and openly mocked. But he tells the friends they're the ones who should be mocked. They're the ones who are demonstrating no wisdom at all. And then back to no hope. He talks about having no hope a lot, which I think is why Eliphaz keyed in on that. A wicked person thinks that he has no hope, and he doesn't see the end of the matter. But he says here in verse 11, his plans and his hopes and dreams have all been ruined. Everything that he had and was wanting to have was just suddenly taken away from him, which is true. It was all gone in a matter of moments. And he says he's ready for the grave. He says at this point he's just ready to go. But it's really pitiful because he says, no matter what, if I embrace the grave, I have no hope. And when I die, whatever hope was left, it dies with me. So he ends on a very, very dark note. We'll get into chapter 18 with Bildad. We won't get through this, but we'll start on it. So let's look at chapter 18, starting in verse 1. Then Bildad the Shuhite replied, "How long until you stop talking? Show some sense, and then we can talk. Why are we regarded as cattle, as stupid in your sight? You who tear yourself in anger, should the earth be abandoned on your account, or rocks removed from their places? Yes, the light of the wicked is extinguished, and the flame of his fire does not glow. The light in his tent grows dark, and the lamp beside him is put out. His powerful stride is shortened, and his own schemes trip him up. For his own feet lead him into a net, and he strays into its mesh. A trap catches him by the heel, a noose seizes him. A rope lies hidden for him on the ground, and a snare waits for him along the path. Terrors frighten him on every side and harass him at every step. His strength is depleted. Disaster lies ready for him to stumble. Parts of his skin are eaten away. Death's firstborn consumes his limbs. He is ripped from the security of his tent and marched away to the king of terrors. Nothing he owned remains in his tent. Burning sulfur is scattered over his home. His roots below dry up, and his branches above wither away. All memory of him perishes from the earth. He has no name anywhere. He is driven from light to darkness and chased from the inhabited world. He has no children or descendants among his people, no survivor where he used to live. Those in the west are appalled at his fate, while those in the east tremble in horror. Indeed, such is the dwelling of the unjust man, and this is the place of the one who does not know God. And so Bildad, very harsh response. It's interesting, he starts and he opens his speech by accusing Job of the same thing that Job has been accusing them of. And so it's clearly become an argument. You're just saying hurtful things. You're just blabbering on and on. And they're all going to be saying this to one another. I'm moving very quickly. Verse 4, he talks about the fact, he says, you're the one who is tearing yourself up. Because Job had just previously, in chapter 16, said that God was the one tearing him apart. And he says, no, it's you. You yourself are the one who is doing this to you. I don't know exactly how to take, I take the latter part of verse 4 as, we would say, should heaven and earth be moved for you? I think he's saying kind of the same thing, but he's talking about God throughout. And I think he's basically saying, Job, you're establishing, what you're saying goes against the very understood order of God. That wicked people suffer, good people are prospering, and good people are blessed by God. And you're going against the truths of God. And he's accusing Job of just openly rejecting God and God's teachings, which of course Job isn't intentionally doing, certainly. And then he has his own description of the wicked. And a lot of this stuff, once again, if Job is sitting there listening, which there's a chance he is, or there's a good chance he's not at this point, Job is hearing things that apply to himself. His tent is darkened. He's been trapped, caught in the snare. Job uses that language. Job has said himself, he says that God has snared me. God has trapped me. God has hedged me in and built a prison around me. He goes on to say his terrors frighten him. Job has said that about himself, that even when he finally sleeps or tries to sleep, that he just has these nightmares. That his strength is famished, that everything around him is just destruction and calamity. He says his skin is devoured by disease. That sounds familiar. And on and on. And so his description of the wicked, just like Eliphaz's before, is clearly him looking at Job and saying to Job things that apply directly to Job. That's what they're all going to do. And then we'll get to Job's retort after next, where he has his own description of the wicked. So if you want to read ahead, we're going to finish out the second cycle. Next Sunday, we will look at the third cycle, which is quite short, and then we'll look at chapter 28, which is this wisdom poem, this wisdom interlude. So if you want to read ahead, I would read ahead starting in chapter 19 through 28. We'll talk about those next time. Thanks for your comments tonight.